Last week I talked about forgiveness. More specifically, I talked about the first step in the fourfold path to healing and forgiveness, a concept developed by Bishop Desmond Tutu. For those who were not here, let me quickly review some of the premise of the theory before moving to the second step of this journey. Whenever someone does something that harms us, no matter how large or how small the offense, we have a choice to make. We can choose to retaliate or to get even. We can choose to find a way to punish the offender. That choice leads us down a path that ultimately leads to escalating violence, because we no longer see the person who hurt us as a person, but someone who is less than human and not deserving of our love. If we believe that all people are created in the image of God, however, we start with an understanding that we share a common humanity, that we all make mistakes, and that maintaining the relationship takes priority over the harm that has been done. So we respond to the same event by making a different choice. And that choice is to work towards a restored relationship. We do that by following the fourfold path. These are the 4 steps along that pathway. Get there? There it is. Telling the story, naming the hurt, granting forgiveness, and renewing the relationship. And while it is a simple path, it is not necessarily easy, although some of us practice it without even realizing we're doing so. Imagine, for example, that you hear a crashing sound in the room where your 3-year-old son or your 3-year-old granddaughter is playing. You go and find what you feared when you heard the noise. Your favorite vase has been broken. At that instant, you have a choice to make. You can scream and holler and punish the child. Quite honestly, many of us do that without being aware that we have made a choice to do so. We could also choose to say something like, "That vase was a special gift from my grandmother, and now it's gone. It reminded me of someone who loved me very much, and now it's broken, and I'm sad. I love that vase, but I love you more than I love the vase. Will you help me sweep up the pieces?" You're doing something like that. We're telling our son or our granddaughter the story. We're naming our hurt. We're granting forgiveness, and we're cherishing the relationship. It not only goes through all the 4 steps of the fourfold path, it also teaches compassion and empathy. Now, last week we put the focus on telling the story. We talked about how important it is to tell the story in order to start the journey towards forgiveness. Today I want to explore the second step, naming the hurt. Now, the two are very closely related, but they're not the same. Telling the story is about the facts of an event. Naming the hurt is about the emotional response to the event. It addresses the grief of loss that comes when our dignity or our safety or our trust has been broken. Before exploring that, though, let me back up a little bit and talk about a few things that forgiveness is not. First off, it does not require an apology. The choice to forgive is on the part of the one who's been hurt. Making an apology a requirement for forgiveness only adds strings that ensnare us to the wrongdoer. It takes away power from us, the power and the freedom to forgive. If we insist on an apology, we may become a prisoner of their actions and continue to suffer. And by suffer, I'm talking about spiritually and physically. Bishop Tutu refers to study after study that has been done confirming the physical impact of not forgiving. One that caused me to raise my eyebrows was the one that said that the loneliness of not forgiving is worse for your physical health than smoking is. Another misperception that comes with forgiving is when we hear someone say, forgive and forget. Forgiveness is not forgetting. We do not forget the story or the hurt. Take the example of Jesus. He comes to his disciples on Easter Sunday and shows them the scars in his hands. They've been forgiven, but the event has not been forgotten. He simply chooses a new way to tell the same story. In the same way, when we forgive, we are no longer a victim of the past hurt, but it's still remembered. As I said earlier, forgiveness is not easy, but it is life-giving. The fourfold path was developed and tested as part of our South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How many of you really know what that is? Some of us have heard about it. Starting in 1996, after the end of the apartheid system, the commission was created to bear witness to record, and in some cases grant amnesty to the perpetrators of crimes relating to human rights violations, as well as reparation and rehabilitation. This is how Bishop Tutu speaks about their work in his book. Our journey in South Africa was quite long and treacherous, he says. Today, it is hard to believe that up until our first democratic election in 1994, ours was a country that institutionalized racism, inequality, and oppression. In apartheid South Africa, only white people could vote, earn high-quality education, and expect advancement or opportunity. There were decades of protest and violence. Much blood was shed during our long march to freedom. When at last our leaders were released from prison, it was feared that our transition to democracy would become a bloodbath of revenge and retaliation. Miraculously, he says, we chose another future. We chose forgiveness. At the time, we knew that telling the truth and healing our history was the only way to save our country from certain destruction. And so they developed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where they could tell the story and name the hurt before granting forgiveness. I really don't want to make a practice of reading the book to you, but I think the first story in the book is one that helps illustrate how this works. He begins the story with a description that sounds like a coroner describing a body and trying to determine the cause of death, except it's the widow of the man she's describing all 43 stab wounds and the severed hand. It's her telling the story. Then follows the story of her daughter, who talks about what it was like to live and grow up without her father, experiencing that kind of grief and those years of hardship. Is where she names the hurt. And then the daughter says, I would love to know who killed my father. We want to forgive them. We want to forgive, but we don't know who to forgive. Now, his book talks about how to forgive, and we must begin by naming that hurt in order that needs to be forgiven, even if we don't know who we are forgiving. And we do that by telling the story and by naming the hurt. When we deny our feelings, when we choose not to name our hurts and instead reject the pain of our losses, we always end up seeking destruction. We may enter the cycle of revenge in a hope that hurting others will fix our pain, only to find out it doesn't. The only way to stop the pain is to accept it. The only way to accept it is to name it, and by naming it, to fully experience and feel it. Several times throughout the book, Bishop Tutu refers to the brutal murder of a woman named Angela in April of 2012. It happened in Washington, D.C., where Angela was working as a babysitter for Bishop Tutu's daughter, Fo. Part of naming the hurt included the very real desire to punish the person who had inflicted this awful event in her own home. At first, there was just grief and guilt, Foe says. I mean, after all, Angela wouldn't have been there if she had not hired her. And then she continues, but then the fury came. This person not only stole Angela's life, he stole our freedom and our sense of safety, our sense of place, and even our home. We can never go back there. The items he stole from the house are nothing compared to stealing our happy memories. Our home isn't a home anymore. It's a crime scene. My daughter can't think of her bedroom without thinking of violence and murder. How do you ever recover that sense of safety? It's just gone. She goes on to tell how those feelings of rage and the nightmares of her children continue to come in waves. Who can she tell? Ideally, she would tell the person who committed this horrible crime. But if he's not available, or they don't know who it is yet, or if she's not ready to name it in his presence, she still needs to tell the story and to name the hurt. And in order to do that, she needs a safe place to do so. That's where I believe Paul's letter to the church in Corinth provides some guidance. He reminds us that we are each given special gifts. The gifts are as diverse as we are, but they're given for the benefit of the whole community, not for the individual. It's true that some of us are particularly gifted at listening, but there is a sense in which the diverse nature of the church makes the community of faith a good place to share our stories. In that sense, we are not unlike the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A part of the task of the church is to hear the hurts of others as they move toward forgiveness and reconciliation. But that means we must learn to listen without judging the one telling the story. We only add to their burden when we defend the person who's done the wrong, even if the wrong is only a misperception of the actual truth of an event. It's the hurt that needs healing. Naming that hurt, along with telling the story, puts us on the journey toward forgiveness. And with forgiveness comes a renewed sense of our own dignity. It allows us to build something new from the wreckage of what was lost. Next week, we'll look at the next two steps, granting forgiveness, which may be the hardest of them, and restoring the broken relationship. In the end, that's God's desire for us as well. We have been granted forgiveness by a loving God who knows the story and has experienced the hurt of our rejection. Grace alone brings us here to be reminded of the forgiveness God offers.